All right, YouTube. Pope Francis just came out and condemned marijuana legalization. And as usual, as we see in the Vatican, the Pope has come out, and this is a tradition that goes back centuries, has come out and condemned something without giving any actual, doctrinal explanation, number one, of why he thinks the way he does. And number two, has provided no feasible alternative for those, Catholic lay people out there who hang on every word he says, as to what he would do to solve the problem. This has been a problem with the Catholic Church for some time, that they will condemn something, or they'll say, this is a good idea, this is a bad idea, we support this, this is anti-biblical, this is against Jesus or something. But they won't actually offer a pragmatic solution to the problems that they're talking about. In the case of marijuana, he's simply saying that the answer to drugs is not drugs, essentially. And the answer to drug addiction is not to make these substances legal. First, he is apparently ignoring the existence of the Catholic nation of Portugal, which actually legalized everything, decriminalized everything, gives addicts treatment. He said nothing about the drug war. Now here's a pope who, for all intents and purposes, has been rather pacifistic the entire time he's been there, and who has stood against war and so forth, tried at least in a lukewarm manner to bring some sort of peaceful solution to the problem in Israel and Palestine, who seem to be more level-headed and more in touch with reality than certainly the past popes have been. And yet he comes out and says, well, you shouldn't legalize marijuana, but I'm not going to give you any clue as to what I think would be a proper solution. I think the problem is the drug war. If Pope Francis is worried about people being addicted, the drug war has just caused addiction to rise. We've seen this now for decades, especially post-1980s, when all of this crack and so forth and all of these pharmaceuticals started entering the market because the prices of everything else rose. We've seen this problem now for decades where people, they're addicted to drugs, they get caught with drugs, they get thrown in jail. The moment they get out, the first thing they do is move and try to get drugs. It doesn't work. And you see now, in Colorado and Washington State, the level of overall crime has dropped. Firstly, because you're no longer classifying a completely non-violent so-called moral offense as a crime to begin with. People are getting essentially treated how alcohol users would be treated. No, Pope Francis isn't talking about alcoholism because the Bible talks about how great alcohol is. He's not saying a word about that. A lot of people are addicted to alcohol. Very few people are addicted to marijuana. There are plenty of people who are dependent on it and who smoke it from time to time to deal with stress, but ultimately it is not, at a chemical level, marijuana, while you can become dependent on it, is not as addictive as alcohol and tobacco. Now, I've talked about the Portuguese model and how it should replace our current drug war stratagem, how it can work. It has worked where it's been used. You see Uruguay has legalized marijuana as well. That's, again, a Hispanic, Catholic nation. And Catholics in general have been on the forefront as long as we're talking about the Christian body. It's the Catholics that have been on the forefront of trying to reform these things, whereas the Protestants are usually the ones that stand against meaningful drug law reform, and they want to go on their moral crusades. We see the same thing with gay marriage and so forth. Nobody expects the Pope, by the way, no matter how progressive he's perceived as being, to come out and say, well, yeah, pot's great, pot's fine, you should legalize pot. Nobody's saying that, but why doesn't he offer an actual solution other than end the drug war and adopt the Portuguese model, which has worked? Is there some other solution that he believes will work better? If so, most of us are probably all ears. He's not a politician, he's not a lawmaker, he doesn't actually hold any real power in the United States or in any of these Western countries beyond he's the figurehead of the Catholic Church. I'd still be interested in seeing what his solution would be. Probably it would be, well, show compassion and mercy to these poor addicts. Well, the thing is, we can't do that as long as we're rounding them up and putting them in prison. There are people that are in prison for the rest of their lives in some 3-strike states for the crime of mere possession. Not drug dealing, not going to a kindergarten and offering pills to little children, not shooting heroin into their eyeballs and crashing their car into a tree, not getting high and attacking somebody, simply possessing a small amount of marijuana, and they have gone to jail for life. This law, this legal system that we currently use, does not make sense. The only one benefiting from it are the for-profit prisons. And the government, as far as it endorses these moral crusades. You've got more and more people now coming out and saying that maybe, kind of, sort of, our drug situation is not quite right, and maybe we've been doing a disservice by locking people up for 10 years for having a joint in their pocket. Well, yeah, you think? It's failed. The fact is that Pope Francis comes from a religion whose early adherents were smoking hash and opium anyway, so I'm not sure exactly what his problem is. The thing is, how we view drugs is not how the ancient world viewed them. The ancient world viewed them as spiritually enhancing substances, at least if they were used properly. Only post-1800s with these sort of moral crusades, which, by the way, the feminist movement, the early feminists were involved intrinsically with the evangelicals at the time, which is something that I think most people would find amusing if they looked at some of these early feminist leaders and they looked at the temperance movement. The thing is, we started this moral crusade. It was never biblical to begin with. There is nothing in the Bible that says thou shalt not smoke weed, thou shalt not use opium, and so forth. Do I think that people should be walking around all day in a drug-induced stupor? Of course not. If somebody's addicted, get them treatment. Treat them like what they are. They're an addict. They're addicted to drugs. They're not, saying I'm going to be a total asshole and give these drugs out to children and ruin lives. We've got this view of the drug addict as someone sinister, someone violent, which most drug addicts aren't violent at all. I've met drug addicts. They don't go around beating each other up for a fix. What they do instead usually is they beat themselves up for a fix. They'll go whore themselves on the street or do menial labor in order to score their crack rocks. And I pity them, because most of the time these people, they started using drugs when they were young in their rebellious phase, or to deal with stress, or they were forced into that situation. They were already involved with some other activity that led to them becoming an addict. And it's largely, in those cases, it can be the result of poverty, low educational attainment, and so forth. Now, although there are, PhDs that snort cocaine, so I guess I shouldn't say that about all drugs. But let the Pope come out and say what his fucking idea is. If he wants to weigh in on this issue and be taken seriously, and not be looked at like all the other popes, which is, don't use drugs, they're evil, but I'm not going to tell you what my ideas are, then let him come out and state what his idea is. And the funny thing is, all these leftists were sort of adoring the Pope. They're saying, oh, he's supporting wealth redistribution, he's glorious, he's a wonderful Pope, he understands Jesus' message of communism or whatever, even though Jesus was really more of an anarchist than anything else and was a lunatic. And now they're faced with the situation where they have to stop liking the Pope because he won't let them smoke their weed. And all these crazy Starbucks Marxists, of course, they're all on drugs, because you have to be on something in order to actually support left economics, which have never worked before and never will in the future, and have crushed entire nations underfoot. But the Pope hasn't offered any solution. So until he does, until he says, well, I think this would be a good idea instead of just blanket legalization, if he comes out with that, then let's entertain his idea and look at it and then think about it in at least a theoretical manner and say, can I think of any reasons this would work well or not work so well? But he hasn't. He's just said, don't legalize it. But the thing is, it's already becoming legal. I believe there's an amendment that just passed the House last night, if I remember correctly, that would protect states where medical marijuana and so forth are already legal from any federal intrusion, which I think is a great idea. Here in Vermont, it's decriminalized. Now, I don't have to use drugs in order to support decriminalization. I don't even support legalization of marijuana or any of these drugs. I support decriminalization. I don't think that people should be thrown in jail for simple possession. I think that instead, you give them a slap on the wrist fine, and instead of putting them in prisons by the millions every year, you set up treatment centers, and you get them treated. And I think that there is a difference. And the law doesn't look at it this way, because the law is blind, deaf, and dumb at this point. But there is a difference between a person who smokes pot once in a while, gets caught with a joint in their pocket, and somebody who is addicted to meth or heroin or crack. There is a difference. It's clear that there's a difference. These substances were not all created equal. There are some that are very harmful and extremely addictive. Alcohol is one of them, by the way, and that's perfectly legal as long as you're 21. And then there are substances that are not so dangerous, like marijuana. I don't use marijuana anymore. I have no interest in using marijuana anymore. But I don't want to see people thrown in jail for long periods of time for the so-called crime of choosing to inhale burning plant matter. I would extend that to crack and meth and heroin and all of these other substances too. If somebody wants to use drugs, they're going to use them if they derive enjoyment from it. I do not believe it is the government's responsibility to babysit people, and I don't think that the Catholic Church should just wantonly weigh in on this subject without providing some alternative view of how we can solve the rampant problem of people being thrown in jail for possessing marijuana or possessing any other drug. I would point this out, that there are dozens and dozens of mind-altering substances, many of which I've used, that are completely legal. Morning glory and amanita mushrooms and lactica virosa and all of these other plants are legal. The California poppies growing in your garden, guess what? If you grind up the seeds and smoke them, it provides a high similar to cannabis. They contain small amounts of opium. And nobody's saying, oh, well, we need to outlaw these plants because they're popular gardening plants. Or what about Trichocereus pachnoi, mescaline, that's grown all over the South. You used to see mescaline cactuses 10 feet tall lining the roads of southern Texas. Anyone could have come along, cut one down, put it in the back of their pickup, drove it home, and just extracted all the juice and stayed high for months. And it's legal because it's a landscaping cactus. The only difference is pot threatened industrial interests, and all of these other substances, a lot of them are synthetic or partially synthetic and require processing. Whereas with Morning Glory, processing involves grind up the seeds and eat them. And processing amanita mushrooms is hang them in front of your fire and dry them to remove some of the muscarine and turn it into mucimol and convert some ibotenic acid. By the way, I'm not trying to give instructions on these substances. I'm just pointing out there are substances out there that are legal. And I don't see the Pope talking about them. I don't see the prison industry talking about them. They're not going to outlaw Morning Glory. They're not going to outlaw mushrooms that grow wild anyway. They did that with psilocybin. Guess what? Psilocybin growing on your lawn is legal until you pick it and start eating it. No, it grows wild across most of the United States. There are liberty caps that grow up in Canada. It's not just a desert-dwelling mushroom that grows in South Cali. Let the Pope come forth and give us his glorious, enlightened, supposedly divine idea of how we deal with this problem without either continuing to incarcerate people for no reason and wasting hundreds of millions of dollars of our tax money and propping up corrupt prisons that aren't even regulated by the government to any great degree and are overcrowded. We could fix our prison overcrowding problem just through decriminalization and granting, pardons to people who were thrown in the clink for 20 years for having a joint back in the 70s or whatever. It's ridiculous. The current drug war has failed. The drug war failed. All these moral crusades failed. Every single goddamn one of them. There's not a single late 1800s, early 1900s, vaguely connected to the temperance movement moral crusade that worked. We are incarcerating people for no reason. for things which constitutionally the government shouldn't even be regulating to begin with. The states maybe have a claim to be able to regulate them. The federal government certainly does not. We handle age of consent laws at the state level. That's another thing that was connected to the moral crusades of the temperance era. That's when the first age of consent laws came about. Before that, you could marry a 12-year-old. These laws were designed as part of the Christian temperance movement. And the ones that moved to the federal level don't work. The ones that stayed at the state and local level generally work a lot better, although there are still some kinks to work out. But the drug war evolved into this massive witch hunt because it was considered a grave social ill that somebody might choose to smoke marijuana. Well, as long as somebody's not doing it next to me because I find the smell nauseating, I don't care if they smoke pot. Let them ruin their lives. If they're so much of a loser that they're just sitting there smoking pot all day, just say, okay, no handouts for you. You take care of yourself and end up homeless, and then you can get treatment and maybe get your life back on track. If you're really that dumb to get addicted to marijuana of all substances, then you probably deserve what's coming to you. As for these people that are smoking crack and heroin and stuff, you don't throw them in jail so they go through severe withdrawal and they get out and they immediately go for a needle. That's not how you take care of things. I would think that would be more anti-biblical than putting drugs in your body. When you think about it, aren't you supposed to show mercy towards these poor wretched souls that have strayed so far in life? I guess the Catholic Church's idea is just pray for these people. Well, guess what? Your prayers haven't worked for the last 2,000 years. They're not going to work for the next 2,000 years. So we need to reform our drug laws in the Western world severely. I mean, complete overhaul. And meanwhile, the Pope douchebag is just coming out and doing what every other pope's done, which is, oh, well, keep it illegal, but I'm not going to tell you how I would deal with the issue, other than throw people in jail like we've been doing, so that we can send our priests in and convert them to Catholicism, and then when they get out, they'll still be drug addicted, but they'll be Catholic drug addicts, so it's okay. Which seems to be the way the Catholic Church has traditionally operated. So the Pope should shut the fuck up unless he's got some better ideas. And most people won't be willing to call him out. They'll either say, oh, well, I disagree, but it's okay because he's the Pope, and he's just antiquated and ancient. He's fucking, 70-something. Or they'll say, oh, this is a great idea. The Pope finally found sense. He's given up talking about wealth redistribution and social Marxism, and now he's coming out to fight this horrible, horrible drug problem that we've got in the world that we created anyway with the drug war, but he's helping to fight this horrible moral ill. The Pope doesn't know what he's talking about. He probably hasn't studied these things. He's just relying on the Bible, which I know is enough for some people who are illiterate and can't read anything else. But for the rest of us who have actually read more than one book in our lives, and who actually look at these things and think critically, the drug war has failed and the Pope has offered no new solutions. That's about all. Peace out.